The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland says the Interior Department will conduct a comprehensive review of what she calls the troubled legacy of federal boarding school policies. She made the announcement yesterday when she addressed the mid-year conference of the National Congress of American Indians. The investigation will be led by Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland. Haaland wants the Interior Department to prepare a report with historical records with an emphasis on cemeteries or potential burial sites. She says this work will help address intergenerational trauma from the boarding school era. And she says, while the work will be painful, it's important to acknowledge the past in order to work towards a future that everyone can be proud to embrace. Hopi Tribal Chairman Timothy Navanyoma weighed in on the announcement. Hundreds of Hopi children were sent to the Phoenix Indian Industrial Boarding School.
In conclusion, had it been somebody else, not of a Native background, Native culture, would this actually be getting the attention that it's getting today? My thought is no. So I would align with everybody else in that same thought, in that concept that because we do have a Native American woman, a strong woman at the helm who understands some of these concerns, is probably the only reason why this is being brought up now as a scenario.
Assimilation efforts started with the Indian Civilization Act in 1819. By the late 1800s, the U.S. government opened the first federal boarding schools. Native American children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools. During that time, they were assimilated or tried to be assimilated into white culture. The slogan, "Kill the Indian to save the man," was coined by Richard Henry Pratt, who created the federal boarding school system. Recently, Secretary Haaland wrote an editorial in the Washington Post and described her grandfather's experience as a survivor of the Carlisle Indian School. She says she was prompted to start this investigation after hearing about the 215 graves recently discovered at a boarding school for First Nations children in Canada. She wants the final report to be completed by April 1st of next year. After a long year of staying home because of COVID, children are happy to return to a traditional teachings camp in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Reporter Elia Chavez has more.
The water helps the crops.
Small hands pushing and pulling a piece of clay to mold into a pot. That's what the children at the traditional teachings camp are doing. The students here are learning about Pueblo ways of life at the first camp held since the coronavirus pandemic began.
It's really a blessing because we didn't get to have this camp last year, and so it's so nice having the students come back.
Organizers at this 4-day summer camp, hosted by the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, have created activities to promote cultural learning. Every day, students start their day spending time in the Resilience Garden, learning about seeds and the agricultural ways of Pueblo communities.
It's important for our youth to share our knowledge, especially for our urban Indian youth that don't get they don't have the ability to go back to their homelands, especially now during COVID.
The camp includes Native and non-Native children, something organizers say teaches cultural humility by exposing children to another lifestyle. On this day, campers learned from Claudia Mitchell, a potter from Acoma Pueblo. The project was heartwarming for her.
Being with the little kids, it's just so much energy, and it's like, they're just so eager and they want to do things right away. It's like, that's one thing about making potters, like you need to learn patience and eventually, maybe one or two of them will grow up and, be able to carry it on.
Making pottery is a favorite for campers who attend every year. In Albuquerque, Aaliyah Chavez, Indian Country Today.
A second camp will be held later this month. Alaska Natives and several tribes are applauding President Joe Biden's plans to revive a ban on road building in the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. The roadless rule prohibits some road construction and cutting, selling, or removing timber. The rule has been in place for 20 years. Then last fall, federal officials exempted southeast Alaska from the rule for 3 months just before former President Donald Trump's term ended. To read more on this story, go to our website, IndianCountryToday.com, and search for the headline, Joe Biden to reinstate road ban for Tongass. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Tholahungva. John Tasuda joins us today to take a closer look at some of the news coming out of the Interior Department.
But first, we'll check in with the chairman of the Nez Perce Tribe when we come back. Samuel N. Penny is chairman of the Nez Perce Tribal Executive Committee. His tribe, the Nez Perce, faced challenges during the pandemic, and there's a large Department of Fisheries Resource Management. With over 200 employees and an annual budget of $20 million in a 3-state work area, which includes north central Idaho, northeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington, all in Nez Perce ancestral land. Welcome, Chairman Penny.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
Well, we'd like to start by just asking kind of the big overview question about how the tribe fared during the pandemic.
Well, I think like most tribes across the country, we kind of struggled in the beginning, but I think after we got things underway and got things organized within the tribe, I think things went quite well based on the circumstances.
As we mentioned in the intro, one of the challenges is natural resources. And I think most people don't realize that when you look at state governments and tribal governments, it's the tribes that put in significant resources into natural resource recovery, and particularly salmon. Maybe talk about some of the efforts you're working on in that regard.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the Nez Perce Tribe has one of the largest tribal fisheries departments in the country. And we have within our Indian Claims territory, which is over 13.2 million acres, we have several fisheries offices. We have one in Northwest Oregon and Joseph, Oregon. We have one in McCall, Idaho. Of course, here at the tribal headquarters in Lapwai, Idaho, and in Orfino, Idaho as well. So our natural resource, especially our fisheries, is quite a large department. They do a lot of recovery work, especially with working with endangered species, salmon and steelhead.
There's a conversation going on now about dam removal and the importance of that to the salmon recovery. What's your perspective on that?
Well, the tribe's been proactive in dam removal since 1999. We feel it's been a detriment to fish recovery in our area, especially listed stocks of salmon. So the tribe's been quite active. Just recently, the affiliated tribe of Northwest Indians adopted a resolution supporting what is called the Simpson Plan, which would provide several billions of dollars for the Northwest to address not only dam removal, but also to impact other communities as well.
I should mention Representative Mike Simpson is a Republican congressman from Idaho who has led this initiative. In terms of salmon recovery, I mean, it's so essential to tribal communities throughout the Northwest, but how are you proceeding to make sure that happens for the next generation?
Well, I think, unfortunately, many times tribes have to resort to the legal avenues, which we've had to do over the last 20 to 30 years on what they call biological opinions in order to restore the salmon, especially in the upper reaches of the Columbia Basin. So, sometimes we have to use illegal avenues. Of course, we try to work things out with whomever we're working with to address our mutual concerns, but sometimes we have to resort to legal actions to not only protect our tribe's right, but other tribes' rights in the area as well, our treaty reserve rights.
I'm curious about your neighbors. So much of the economy in Idaho, at least on paper, claims that the system that's in place is what benefits them. But clearly that's not been the case. But how do your neighbors in Lewiston and other communities view dam removal?
Well, I think it depends, of course, who you talk to. See in the local papers, some of the local farmers or grain cooperatives oppose dam breaching because they ship a lot of their products, by barge, and they'll say that trucking and rail is too expensive and it's going to increase their costs. But that's also part of the Mike Simpson proposal, to try to address how products are shipped from this area. So you get a wide range of views on dam breaching. Tribes are mainly supportive. Other industry leaders are not. One just recently, Schweitzer Engineering out of Pullman, Washington, their owner came out against dam breaching just recently. So there's some various opinions on what's being done along dam breaching.
And I think one of the reasons that people don't realize why dam breaching, well, there are many reasons, but one that's really basic science is water temperature. And salmon need cold water in order to prosper.
That's correct. And so with the dams that are in place for our area, the fish that out-migrate and return as adults, they have to go through eight hydroelectric dams, and we're talking about the 4 lower Snake River dams. But all those dams, have slack water, and it warms the temperature, makes the fish more susceptible to predators. When you spill water, or if you spill too much water, it causes gas bubble disease in the fish. And then one of the main things is when fish are reared up in our area, in our fisheries program, the outmigration, which used to take maybe a few days, now takes weeks. And they have to travel through those unfavorable conditions to reach the ocean.
One of the things that I think has changed in Idaho particularly, but throughout the Northwest, has been the increase in salmon fishing as a serious sport fishery. I remember going through Riggins and places like that and seeing signs that this family supported by salmon dollars, and then you see basically combat fishing. Does that help your case in terms of getting the word out that this is a resource worth protecting?
Yes, I think it does help us. There are several communities. You mentioned Riggins, Idaho. There's also Orfino, Idaho, and even Lewiston, Idaho, where the fisheries is a big industry. Not only for hotels, fishery-related tackle, all the things you need to go fishing, grocery stores, restaurants, all those businesses benefit from the fisheries. And the Nez Perce Tribe has always said that, that the tribe is leading a lot of efforts, as well as other tribes, in fish recovery. So it's not only benefiting our tribal membership, but it's benefiting the sports fishermen as well, and their local communities.
I want to ask you about something else, Chairman. You've been in office a long time and have a good perspective. Your district once included kind of the original Sagebrush Rebellion in Congress, Helen Chenoweth, and now you have candidates for governor who are kind of in that same sphere with Ammon Bundy and some of the other groups running. I'm just curious your take on that in terms of Idaho perception around the country.
Well, over the years, and you're probably well aware, in northern Idaho, they used to have some white supremacist groups. And when I used to travel, that would be one of the first things people would ask me about those groups. And I said, well, they're not in our particular area, but they are around. And we had one in our area that has since quieted down for a number of years. But that perspective is still out there on the white supremacists. And of course, now with all shootings and things that go on almost on a daily basis throughout the country. We've been fortunate not to see that in our area, but as far as on the state level, Idaho is a very conservative state. I think all the elected officials are Republican. The Nez Perce Tribe has always tried to work not only at the state level, at the federal level. You know, we work with all sides to try to reach agreement on what we're working on. But you know, with some of the people that you mentioned that are currently announced that they're running for governor, you know, it does cause alarm for not only Nez Perce Tribe, I think should cause alarm for all people in the state of Idaho.
It really puts pressure on things like treaty rights and stuff, because one of their tenets is to get the federal government out of Idaho, which has many implications.
Right. So, you know, I think many states have always, you know, wanted management of federal lands. Nez Perce Tribe has always opposed that. And part of the main reason is that, you know, our treaties are with the federal government. Our treaty of 1855, we have subsequent treaties as well, but all those treaties reserved rights for Nez Perce Tribe, and the state really has no trust responsibility to Nez Perce Tribe, but the U.S. federal government does. So we'll always oppose state management of federal land.
Chairman, I want to ask you about how you're managing the resources coming in from the federal government for pandemic relief, and kind of what your plans are for that.
Well, back in March of 2020, the Nez Perce Tribe declared a state of public emergency, and of course it affected us, you know, our workforce as well. Many work from home remotely. So we've had a CARES committee that has, you know, been overseeing the funds to make sure that they're being spent according to the guidelines. And that's been difficult at times. And of course, tribes are at a disadvantage, receiving the money very late and having an initial deadline of last December 31st and now be extended. So that put pressure on tribes. But you know, the tribes are working diligently to make sure we expend those funds in an appropriate manner. And of course, currently looking at the American Recovery Plan Act funds as well.
Do you see with the American Recovery Plan the opportunity to do new things?
We certainly hope so. I think one of the things that's taking place now is, you know, I think they have a tribal treasury advisory committee that's been meeting with the Department of Treasury, and we want to make sure that it's quite clear on what the allowable uses of those funds are before we do a lot of planning, because you know, we may be planning that something that funds may not be able to be used for.
Thank you so much, Chairman Samuel Penny.
All right, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Up next, John Chisuda joins us for a discussion on the interior budget and more about the boarding school investigation. John Chisuda III is a regular contributor to Indian Country Today. He's worked as a staff director for the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and he is also former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Today he is a partner with Navigators Global, which is a company that provides political services to several industries, including tribes. John Chisuda joins us today to talk about policy and the impact on Indian country. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Mark. Always good to talk with you.
Let's start with the dramatic news yesterday from the Secretary of the Interior about a review of boarding schools. Yes,
it was a strong statement she put out. It'd be an interesting process to see what it comes up with.
It's such an interesting, you've worked on that at Interior yourself, and so it's always such an interesting one because we have on one hand the history, which is pretty dramatic and deeply troubling. On the other hand, there's been changes over the past decades, really, including parents choosing to go to public schools.
True. And so, you know, we made this transition over really 100 years from boarding schools, which were the primary method of educating Indian children on reservations, to having schools run either by the Bureau of Indian Education or by the tribes themselves, but schools located in the communities, which is what most Americans are used to. But we still have some boarding schools, and they're an important part of the education structure in Indian country, particularly on the larger reservations that have some pretty remote communities, and it's difficult to bus kids in and out on a daily basis. So that's a lasting legacy. But as you noted, I think it's a real turnaround story in some ways from the sort of dreaded boarding school history that was there to the boarding schools now are really an opportunity for children to get away from the community that they're in. And I don't mean in a bad way always, but it gives them a place to go where they can meet new people, new kids from other parts of the reservation or even other parts of the country and interact with them in a very positive way. The schools are now really steeped in providing a culturally appropriate education. They try to weave in sort of a spiritual background relevant to the kids that are in their school. And so I think they have really come a long ways from what they used to be and are a positive part of the overall Indian education structure in our country now.
It's interesting, if you look at the whole federal government, there are really only two ways the federal government manages schools, and one is the Bureau of Indian Education and the other is Department of Defense. What's the role of local parents and families in the BIE schools?
So again, one of those things I think that's a success story is this change in sort of a very federal bureau run process to a much more local community input. So virtually every school in the system, whether it's tribally run or whether it's Bureau of Indian Education run, has a parent committee that has a great deal of input into the school. Oftentimes the school administrators will kind of give a heads up to the parents committee on what kind of teachers and who they're bringing in, so they can kind of have an expectation of who their children will be interacting with and getting educated by. The parents committees and the tribes, even for the BIE schools, are very, very involved in the building and refurbishing of schools. And that way, if you go through newer schools now, you'll see a lot of tribal input, whether it's imagery, insignia, sometimes local products, local wood, for example, can be used. These are all inputs that are made by parents and tribal government to input into the schools on the reservations.
Before I get into the history and the trauma, let me ask, what are the capital needs for BIE schools?
Capital needs are tremendous. I mean, really billions of dollars are needed. And so it's a process. There was a part of the GOA, the Great American Outdoors Act, that was passed last year that has a set aside from federal funding that comes from oil and gas, federal oil and gas revenues. So a set aside that will go to funding construction of Indian schools. That runs, it obviously depends on the revenue level, but anticipated to run around $100 million a year for that. And so that's a good base. And then that provides a base above the usual amount that the federal government puts into the president's budget for construction of schools. And an important component of that is sometimes, the old schools can be refurbished, and they often are in a location already that people in the community are used to and kind of want to see their kids continue to go to. So being able to rebuild or refurbish the school there is an important part of the process as well.
Much of the framing of Secretary Deb Haaland's announcement at NCAI was about the historical trauma. How do we get a reconciliation for that and move forward as a country?
Well, I think that first off, you can probably say we're a little bit behind. Other countries have done some major reconciliation, efforts from Australia, South Africa, Canada, and so I think we're a little bit behind on that. And I think what Secretary Haaland was building on was some of the efforts in Canada to acknowledge the past. And I think it's sort of like a person who has an alcohol issue. One of the first things you got to do is acknowledge that you have a history and a problem. And that's probably the first step in this reconciliation. An important step that Secretary Holland has taken is to acknowledge that this history is there. We need to own up to it and then figure out how our communities can heal from it.
We don't have much time left, but I do want to ask you quickly about the budget. As you know, there's two budgets, one that goes to Congress and the one that Congress appropriates. Where are we with that?
The president's budget's in good shape. Went to Congress. That first step was important, but that's taken care of. The congressional budget process is probably going to be rather disjointed this year. I would anticipate that that the Indian programs will probably come out pretty well. There's a lot of support for them in Congress, and at the end of the day, when you look at the total federal budget, the Indian programs don't count for that much in the total dollar figure. So I think they'll be okay, but it will be a long, drawn-out process.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Join us again tomorrow and online at IndianCountryToday.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing Rock. This is Indian Country Today.